The world was still, cloaked in an impenetrable darkness that seemed to swallow sound itself. Then, faintly, a heartbeat broke the silence. Thud, 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 each pulse deliberate, heavy with the weight of life clinging to existence. The rhythm quickened, a frantic drumbeat building to a crescendo, until, boom, the earth unleashed its fury. A monstrous roar tore through the air as an earthquake ripped the city apart. Buildings groaned and buckled, their foundations splintering like brittle bones. Glass shattered in glittering cascades, raining down onto streets that cracked and heaved. Dust billowed upward in choking clouds, a gray shroud that blotted out the sun. When the trembling finally ceased, an eerie hush fell, broken only by the distant wail of sirens and the soft, mournful creak of a city in ruins. In mere seconds, 30 ticks of a clock, life, as the people of this bustling metropolis knew it, had been obliterated. Towering apartment blocks, once alive with the hum of families and flickering lights, now lay as twisted heaps of concrete and steel. Cars, caught mid-flight by the quake's violence, dangled precariously off broken overpasses or sat crushed beneath fallen beams. A child's bicycle, its front wheel bent beyond recognition, rested beside a toppled mailbox, letters spilling into the dust like forgotten promises. The air was thick with ash, stinging the eyes and coating the tongue with a bitter, metallic taste. Amid the wreckage, survivors stumbled through the haze, their faces masks of shock and grief, hands trembling as they called out for loved ones swallowed by the chaos. Rescue workers arrived swiftly, their bright orange vests cutting through the gloom like beacons. They moved with practiced urgency, shouting orders over the crackle of radios, their boots crunching against shattered glass and debris. With gloved hands and heavy tools, they pried at the rubble, searching for any sign of life, a muffled cry, a shifting stone, anything. But as the hours wore on, their shoulders sagged, and their voices grew hoarse. The destruction was overwhelming, a labyrinth of jagged edges and impossible weight. Beneath one particularly massive slab of concrete, buried deep in the heart of the ruins, a tiny light flickered on the brink of extinction. A newborn baby, no more than a few weeks old, lay trapped in a pocket of darkness. Its small hand, caked in dust, protruded from the wreckage, fingers curling weakly before falling still. The child's cries, once piercing and desperate, had dwindled to faint, broken whimpers, barely audible over the wind that whistled through the debris. Above, the rescuers caught the sound, a fleeting, fragile thread of hope. They paused, heads tilting as they strained to pinpoint its source. But the slab was a monolith, its edges jagged and unyielding, and the layers of rubble beneath it formed a tomb no human could breach in time. The team's leader, a weathered man named Javier with deep lines etched into his face, shook his head. "Too deep," he muttered, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We'd need hours we don't have." His crew exchanged glances, their eyes shadowed with the same grim realization. The baby's fate seemed sealed, another casualty of a disaster too vast to fight. They needed a miracle, a spark of the impossible to pierce the despair. And that miracle was already weaving its way through the dust toward them. In the midst of the chaos stood a dog, a scruffy, wiry stray whose presence went unnoticed by the frantic humans. His fur was a tangled mess of dirt and burrs, patched with scars from a life spent fending for himself. His ribs pressed sharply against his thin frame, a testament to days, perhaps weeks, of scavenging for scraps. He had no collar, no tag, no name that anyone had bothered to give him. To the city, he was a ghost, a fleeting shadow slipping through alleys and darting across streets, invisible to those who hurried past. Years ago, he'd been a pup with a family, a blurry memory of warm hands and a soft voice, but they'd abandoned him one rainy night, driving away as he barked after their fading taillights. Since then, trust had been a stranger to him, and survival his only companion. But on this day, something shifted. This dog, whom fate would soon christen Max, stood apart from the chaos, his ears twitching as he lifted his nose to the wind. His amber eyes narrowed, glinting with a quiet, unyielding fire. Then, with a sharp bark that sliced through the stillness, he sprang into motion. Max began to dig. His paws attacked the earth with a ferocity that seemed to defy his gaunt body, claws scraping against stone and sending dirt flying in wild arcs behind him. The sound was relentless, a gritty, rhythmic scrape that echoed through the ruins. Javier, wiping sweat from his brow, turned at the noise, his gaze landing on the stray. He knelt beside Max, watching in stunned silence as the dog burrowed deeper into the rubble. "Wait!" Javier called to his team, his voice tinged with a flicker of curiosity. "Hold on! He's onto something!" The other rescuers paused, their tools clanging to a stop as they gathered around. Max didn't waver. His movements grew more frantic, his whine sharp and insistent. Dust coated his fur, turning his patchy coat a uniform gray, but he pressed on, driven by an instinct no one could explain. Then, abruptly, he stopped. He spun back to the humans, his eyes wide and pleading, his body trembling as if to scream. "Here! It's right here!" What unfolded next was a marvel born of desperation and hope. Javier waved his team forward, their skepticism melting into action. Guided by Max's unwavering certainty, they attacked the spot with renewed vigor. They heaved aside chunks of concrete, their muscles straining against the weight, and pried a twisted rebar with crowbars that groaned under the pressure. Sweat dripped into their eyes, mixing with the dust that clung to their skin, but they didn't stop. The dog's determination had lit a fire in them, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could cheat fate. As they carved a narrow tunnel through the debris, the air thickened with anticipation. Then, from the shadows, came a sound, a soft, trembling whimper, so faint it might have been the wind. Javier, leading the charge, froze as he peered into the passage. There, cradled in a hollow amidst the wreckage, lay a dust-smeared bundle. It was the baby, its tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, fragile breaths, its face streaked with grime. "Oh my God!" Javier whispered, his voice breaking as he reached out with hands that shook from exhaustion and awe. "It's alive!" Max whined beside him, nudging Javier's arm with his wet nose, as if urging him to hurry. The rescuer gently lifted the infant from its prison of rubble, brushing the dirt from its face with a tenderness that belied his rough exterior. The baby's skin was cold to the touch, its lips faintly blue, and for a moment, time seemed to halt. The team held their breath, their eyes locked on the child. Then, a cry. It started weak, a rustle of sound against the silence, but it grew stronger, more defiant, a raw declaration of life refusing to surrender. The sound pierced the air like a blade, and the rescuers erupted. Cheers and laughter mingled with sobs as they clapped each other on the back, some wiping tears from their dust-streaked faces with trembling hands. Max barked once, a triumphant note, his tail wagging so fiercely it sent up little puffs of dust. The days that followed brought healing and reflection. The baby, now safe in a hospital crib, lay swaddled in a soft blanket, its tiny chest rising steadily beneath the hum of monitors. Nurses moved quietly around it, their smiles warm with relief as they adjusted tubes and checked vitals. The child was a fighter, they said, a miracle pulled from the jaws of death. Outside the room, the rescue team gathered, their orange vests swapped for civilian clothes, their faces still carrying the weight of what they'd witnessed. They hadn't forgotten the stray who'd turned the tide. Max stood among them, his fur scrubbed clean for the first time in years, revealing a mottled coat of brown and black that gleamed in the fluorescent light. His eyes, once wary and guarded, now shone with a quiet pride. Javier knelt beside him, running a hand along Max's back before slipping a bright red collar around his neck. The tag jingled softly, engraved with a single word, Max. "A dog like this?" Javier said, his voice thick with gratitude. "He's not just a stray anymore. He's family." Max's journey had come full circle. Once a forgotten soul with no home, no name, and no one to care whether he lived or died, he now sat beside the baby's crib in the hospital room. His ears stood tall, twitching at every sound, and his tail thumped rhythmically against the tiled floor, a steady beat of contentment. The infant cooed softly, its tiny hand flexing in the air, and Max tilted his head, his amber eyes fixed on the child, as if listening to a secret only they shared. He had saved that little life, clawed through a hell of stone, and dust to pull hope from despair's grasp. In return, he'd been given more than scraps or fleeting kindness. He'd found a purpose, a family, and a name that would echo through the city's history. The rescue workers called him their guardian angel, the nurses their mascot, and the storytellers their hero. Max, the dog who had nothing, had given everything, and in doing so, etched his legend into the annals of a city reborn from ruin.